Imagine being told that you are going to die for a murder you did not commit. Imagine spending year after year inside a prison cell, knowing that somewhere outside those walls, the world is moving on without you. Your children are growing up. Your friends are getting older. Technology is changing. People you once knew are building entire lives while you remain in the same place, waiting for a date that could end everything. And now imagine that after almost 30 years, the system that condemned you finally admits that you were innocent. That was Glenn Ford's life. In 1984, Ford was convicted of the murder and robbery of Isidore Roseman, a Shreveport watchmaker and jewelry store owner who had been killed the year before. Ford was a black man in Louisiana, and he was convicted by an all-white jury and sentenced to death. He would eventually spend almost 30 years on Louisiana's death row before prosecutors themselves moved to have his conviction and sentence overturned. But the most disturbing part of Glenn Ford's story is not simply that he was eventually released. It is what happened during the years before his release. Information that could have challenged the state's case existed in police and investigative files. Other suspects had been implicated. Witness testimony would later be questioned. Ford's defense lawyers had little experience with criminal trials, much less a capital murder case. And the prosecutor who had helped send him to death row would eventually look back at the case and admit that he had been far more interested in winning than he should have been. This is not simply the story of a man who was wrongly convicted. It is the story of how a conviction can become stronger than the search for truth, and how difficult it can be to reverse a mistake once the entire system has committed itself to believing it. The story began on November 5th, 1983, in Shreveport, Louisiana. Isidore Roseman was a local watchmaker and jeweler who operated his business from his home. That day, Roseman was found dead inside his shop after being shot. The crime immediately became a serious robbery and murder investigation, and investigators began trying to determine who had entered the business, who had killed Roseman, and where the stolen property had gone. Glenn Ford was known to Roseman. Ford had done yard work for him and had some familiarity with the property. That connection would later become important. But knowing the victim was not proof that Ford had murdered him. The investigation soon focused on Ford after investigators learned that he had been involved in trying to pawn property connected to the robbery. Ford did not deny that he had handled the item. His explanation was that he had received it from another person and had been asked to pawn it. For investigators looking at a violent murder that demanded an answer, however, Ford quickly became a suspect. And once investigators began looking at him as the likely killer, the case started moving in a direction that would define the next 3 decades of his life. The crucial question should have been whether the evidence proved Glenn Ford had committed the murder. Instead, the investigation increasingly became about whether the evidence could be assembled into a case against him. That difference is easy to miss when looking at a case after the fact, but it matters enormously. Once investigators become convinced that they have found the person responsible, information that points somewhere else can begin to look like a distraction rather than a lead. Ford was arrested and eventually charged with first-degree murder. He could not afford a private defense team, so he depended on court-appointed lawyers. And the lawyers assigned to him were not experienced capital defense attorneys. His lead lawyer had never tried a case before a jury. His second lawyer had very little experience and had never handled a capital murder trial. Ford was facing the possibility of execution, yet the people responsible for defending his life lacked the courtroom experience that such a case demanded. Later accounts of the case would point to the inexperience of Ford's defense as one of the major problems surrounding the conviction. That alone did not prove Ford was innocent, but it meant that the defense was entering a death penalty trial at a tremendous disadvantage. The prosecution, meanwhile, was preparing to argue that Ford was responsible for the murder. And when the jury was finally selected, another deeply troubling feature of the case became impossible to ignore. Ford was black. The victim was white. And the jury that would decide whether Ford lived or died was all white. Later accounts documented that black prospective jurors had been struck from the panel. The racial dynamics of the trial became an important part of the case's later examination, particularly because Ford was being tried in a southern parish with a history of racial division. The trial itself was remarkably short. The prosecution presented testimony and evidence intended to connect Ford to the crime. Some of that testimony would later become deeply problematic. Years later, investigators and Ford's lawyers uncovered information suggesting that some of the evidence presented to the jury had been false, misleading, or incomplete. The National Registry of Exonerations notes that state expert testimony was false or misleading and that police officers had lied to the jury about what Ford had told them. But the jury hearing the original case did not know what future investigators would eventually discover. They heard the prosecution's version of events. They heard the defense. And after deliberating for less than 3 hours, they found Glenn Ford guilty. The sentence was death. In that moment, the life of a 34-year-old man changed forever. Ford was no longer simply a suspect. He was a condemned prisoner. He was taken to Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola, where he would spend the next decades of his life on death row. For most people, the words death row are difficult enough to imagine. For Ford, it became an everyday reality. He knew that the state had decided he should die. He knew that his conviction had been affirmed, and he continued to maintain that he was innocent. Years passed. The first years became a decade. The decade became 2, and then the years continued toward 30. Ford lived through the uncertainty that comes with a death sentence, including a period when an execution date came dangerously close. In a later interview, Ford recalled coming within about a week of execution when a judge was preparing to set a death date. Think about what that means psychologically. You are not simply serving a long prison sentence. You are living with the possibility that the state could eventually walk into your cell and take you away to be executed. And all the while, you are telling anyone who will listen that you did not commit the crime. Ford's case did not disappear. His lawyers continued working. Post-conviction attorneys began examining the original investigation more carefully. And as the years passed, the old case began to look very different. There were police reports that had not been properly disclosed to the defense. There were investigative leads involving other suspects. There were accounts that raised questions about the state's original theory. And there were pieces of information that could have given Ford's lawyers another way to challenge the prosecution's case. Among the most important names were Jake and Henry Robinson. The National Registry of Exonerations reports that hidden police reports contained informant tips implicating the two men rather than Ford. Those reports became important because they suggested that investigators had received information pointing toward other people connected to the crime. This was not a simple discovery of one magical piece of evidence. It was something more complicated. The old case contained a collection of facts that, when viewed together, weakened the certainty of Ford's conviction. And that is one of the most disturbing features of wrongful conviction cases. Sometimes there is not one missing clue that suddenly solves everything. Sometimes the truth is scattered across dozens of documents. A police report here, a witness statement there, a contradiction that was never investigated, a suspect who was never pursued far enough, a piece of information that never reached the defense. Each individual piece may seem small, but together, they can completely change the picture. For Glenn Ford, that process took years. In 2000, the Louisiana Supreme Court ordered a hearing on Ford's claim that prosecutors had suppressed evidence that might have implicated Jake and Henry Robinson in the murder. The fact that the courts were still dealing with these issues years after Ford's conviction showed just how much uncertainty surrounded the original case. But Ford remained on death row. The system had already made its decision, and reversing that decision proved much harder than making it. Then, in 2013, something happened that finally pushed the case toward a breakthrough. An informant came forward with information about Jake Robinson. According to the case record, the informant told prosecutors that Robinson had admitted shooting and killing Roseman. That information was enormously important because it did not simply raise another possibility. It gave prosecutors a new account of who had actually committed the murder, and it helped corroborate information that Ford's lawyers had been fighting over for years. For the first time, the state had a reason to look at Glenn Ford's conviction not as a judgment that needed to be defended, but as a judgment that might have been wrong. The investigation moved forward. The old evidence was reconsidered. And eventually, prosecutors reached a conclusion that would have been almost unimaginable decades earlier. Glenn Ford should be released. In March 2014, prosecutors asked the court to vacate Ford's conviction and death sentence. The state acknowledged that credible new evidence supported the conclusion that Ford had not been present at or participated in the robbery and murder of Isidore Roseman. After nearly 30 years, the door that had seemed permanently locked was finally opening. On March 11, 2014, Glenn Ford walked out of the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola. He was 64 years old. He had entered death row as a relatively young man. He walked out as an older man who had spent almost his entire adult life behind prison walls. Reporters gathered around him. They wanted to know what freedom felt like. Ford tried to explain it. But there was something complicated underneath the relief. He was free, but he was also angry. He had lost almost 30 years. He later spoke about his sons, saying that when he left prison, they had been babies, and now they were grown men with children of their own. That one detail says more about lost time than almost any statistic could. A father had gone into prison while his children were young. He came out decades later and discovered that the children he remembered as babies had become fathers themselves. The prison had released him, but it could not give him back the years. And then came one of the most extraordinary chapters of the entire story. The prosecutor who had helped put Glenn Ford on death row was A.M. Marty Stroud III. In 1984, Stroud was a young prosecutor. He had fought for Ford's conviction. He had argued for the death penalty. And years later, he looked back at what had happened and realized that he had been part of something profoundly wrong. Stroud did not simply issue a carefully worded statement. He wrote a remarkable public apology. He described himself as arrogant, judgmental, and far too focused on winning. He admitted that he had not been sufficiently objective. And perhaps most importantly, he acknowledged that he had failed in his duty to make sure that all exculpatory evidence was properly disclosed. Stroud later said that he had been too passive. He had heard rumors about other people being involved, but he did not consider them credible enough to pursue aggressively. In his own reflection, he said that if he had been more inquisitive, perhaps the evidence would have surfaced years earlier. That admission is important because it changes the way the story should be understood. This was not simply a Hollywood-style story about a prosecutor secretly deciding to frame an innocent man. The reality was more complicated. Stroud later said that he was too focused on winning and that he failed to properly question the case in front of him. He had accepted the prosecution's theory. He had not pushed hard enough to investigate information pointing elsewhere, and his failure became part of the machinery that kept Glenn Ford behind bars. In one of the most painful parts of his apology, Stroud acknowledged that he had once treated Ford's death sentence almost like a victory. Years later, he could barely live with the memory. He eventually met Ford face to face. Imagine that meeting. One man had spent decades in prison. The other had spent those same decades outside. One had lost almost 30 years. The other had to confront the knowledge that his work had helped take those years away. Ford did not simply forget what had happened. In a later television interview, Ford said that he did not forgive Stroud, although he was still trying to. He explained that Stroud had not taken only his life away from him, he had taken from his entire family as well. That response is important because forgiveness is often made to sound simple from the outside. But how do you forgive someone for something that cannot be repaired? How do you forgive the loss of 29 birthdays? How do you forgive the years when your children grew up without you? How do you forgive the decades you spent believing that the state might execute you for something you did not do? Ford's story does not offer an easy answer, and even after his exoneration, his problems were not over. Freedom did not suddenly make his life normal. He walked out of prison with almost nothing. ABC News reported that when Ford left prison, he had a state-issued $20 debit card and only 24 cents in his prison account. Everything he owned could fit into 2 cardboard boxes. Think about that. Nearly 30 years of your life are taken away. Then the prison door opens, and the world expects you to start over. But where do you start? What job can you get after spending decades behind bars? How do you rebuild relationships? How do you learn a world that has changed while you were locked away? How do you replace the health, security, and opportunities you lost? And then Ford faced another devastating problem. He was suffering from lung cancer. The illness would eventually take his life. There was also a battle over compensation. Louisiana's compensation system did not provide Ford with the financial restitution he and his supporters believed he deserved. The state's position involved a legal dispute over whether Ford's actions connected to the stolen property made him ineligible for compensation. Stroud himself strongly criticized the state's refusal to compensate Ford and argued that Ford deserved every penny owed to him. So the man who had spent almost 30 years on death row walked free, but the state did not simply hand him the means to rebuild the life that had been taken away. Instead, Ford had to fight again. This time, he was fighting not for his freedom, but for recognition of what that freedom had cost. Meanwhile, his health was deteriorating. The cancer progressed, and Ford had less and less time left. That is perhaps the cruelest irony in the entire story. He had spent decades waiting for freedom, and when freedom finally came, he had very little time to experience it. Glenn Ford died on June 29, 2015, at the age of 65, roughly 15 months after his release. He died from lung cancer. At the time of his release, he had been the longest-serving death row exoneree in the United States, 30 years. That is almost an entire generation. A child born when Glenn Ford entered death row would have been an adult by the time he walked out. The world he entered was almost unrecognizable compared with the one he had left. And yet, despite everything that had happened, Ford had survived. He had maintained his innocence. He had endured years of isolation. He had watched other prisoners come and go. He had come frighteningly close to execution. And eventually, he walked out alive. His case would go on to become part of a much larger debate in America about wrongful convictions and the death penalty. It raised questions about the quality of capital defense. It raised questions about racial discrimination in jury selection. It raised questions about the reliability of witnesses and expert testimony. It raised questions about the obligation of prosecutors to disclose evidence that could help the defense. And most importantly, it raised a question that has no comfortable answer. What happens when the justice system gets a death sentence wrong? If the state imprisons an innocent person for a year, that year can never be returned. If it takes 10 years, those 10 years are gone. If it takes 30 years, the person may walk free only to discover that almost the entire life they were supposed to have is already behind them. And if the state executes an innocent person, there is no correction. There is no appeal that can bring them back. There is no apology that can undo the final moment. That is why Glenn Ford's story matters far beyond Louisiana. It is not simply about one murder in Shreveport. It is not simply about one prosecutor. It is not simply about one jury. It is about what can happen when human beings become convinced that they are right, and then stop asking whether they might be wrong. Glenn Ford was not released because the system suddenly became perfect. He was released because, decades later, lawyers, investigators, and prosecutors finally looked at information that changed their understanding of the case. The evidence had not suddenly appeared from nowhere. Some of the information had existed for years. The difference was that eventually someone was willing to take another look. That is one of the most haunting lessons of the case. Sometimes the truth is not hidden because it does not exist. Sometimes it is hidden because nobody is looking in the right place. Glenn Ford spent nearly 30 years paying the price for that failure. When he finally walked out of Angola, he was free. But freedom did not erase his memories. It did not restore the years. It did not make his children young again. It did not restore the opportunities he had lost. And it did not make the pain disappear. The prosecutor who once fought to put him to death eventually apologized. The state eventually accepted that Ford had not committed the murder. The prison doors eventually opened. But there are some losses that no court order can reverse. Glenn Ford died free. He died knowing that the conviction against him had finally been overturned. But he also died knowing that almost 30 years of his life could never be returned. And perhaps that is the part of his story that should stay with us. Not simply that the system eventually admitted it was wrong, but that it took almost 30 years to do it. Because justice delayed is not always justice restored. Sometimes, by the time the truth finally wins, the person who needed it most has already lost the years that mattered. Glenn Ford's life became a warning about the human cost of a wrongful conviction. A warning about what happens when winning becomes more important than asking difficult questions. A warning about what can happen when evidence is not fully investigated, when defense resources are inadequate, when racial inequality enters the courtroom, and when a conviction becomes so important that the possibility of being wrong is pushed aside. And above all, It is a reminder that behind every case file is a human being, a father, a son, a friend, a man with a future. Glenn Ford went into death row as a man who wanted to prove his innocence. He came out almost 30 years later as a man who had finally been proven right. But the victory came far too late. The prison door opened. The conviction disappeared. The state finally acknowledged the truth, and yet the years remained gone. That is the tragedy of Glenn Ford. He survived death row. He survived a wrongful conviction. He survived nearly 3 decades of waiting for a freedom he had always believed he deserved. But he could never survive the loss of the life those years had taken from him. And that leaves us with one final question. Not simply, how did the system get Glenn Ford's case wrong? But something much harder. How many chances did the system have to get it right?